A quiet afternoon in the park. Lucille O'Neal, tired from her walk, reaches for a bench, only to be turned away with a polite smile hiding an unspoken rule. She doesn't argue. She's been here before. But what they don't know, her son, Big Shaq, saw everything. And this time she won't be the one walking away, because the seat they denied her, now, it belongs to her. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The park stretched wide under the afternoon sun, the manicured lawns glistening with a golden hue. Children laughed near the swings, their voices weaving through the air, mingling with the sound of a nearby fountain. Joggers moved in steady rhythms, their shoes tapping softly against the pavement. Dogs barked playfully, their tails wagging as they chased frisbees thrown by their carefree owners. It was an ordinary day. A perfect day. Lucille O'Neal took slow, measured steps down the pathway, her eyes scanning the park for a quiet place to sit. She had always loved these moments, watching the world move around her, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. Age had slowed her down, but her spirit remained steady. She had lived long enough to see the world change, to see her son grow into a giant, not just in size, but in status. But here, today, she was just another elderly woman looking for a moment of rest. She spotted a bench tucked beneath the shade of an old oak tree, its wooden surface worn but welcoming. As she approached, a small group of well-dressed individuals, 2 men in tailored suits and a woman in a pristine sundress, stood nearby, engaged in light-hearted conversation. They barely noticed her at first, too absorbed in their laughter. Lucille took a step forward, about to lower herself onto the seat. A voice cut through the air, light but laced with something cold. "Excuse me, ma'am," one of the men said, tilting his head slightly. "This bench isn't for everyone." Lucille paused, her hands resting gently on the armrest of the bench. Her fingers brushed against the wood, but she did not sit. She looked at the man, then at the others. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes held something else, something unspoken, yet painfully familiar. Her face remained unreadable, her posture relaxed, yet something in her chest tightened. She had been here before. She had felt this before. Without a word, she straightened up, nodded ever so slightly, and stepped away from the bench. She did not plead, did not argue. That was not her way. Dignity was something no one could take from her, no matter how hard they tried. She walked away. But she was not alone. From a distance, he saw it all. Shaquille O'Neal stood near a stretch of trimmed hedges, dressed casually in a simple t-shirt and joggers, a cap pulled low over his forehead. He had come to the park for fresh air, for a break from the constant hum of cameras, endorsements, and business meetings. He had come here to feel normal again. But nothing about this moment felt normal. He watched his mother, his rock, his guiding light, turn away from that bench, her back straight, her walk steady, but her silence louder than any scream. His jaw tightened, his fists curled at his sides. The world knew him as Big Shaq, the larger-than-life basketball icon, the millionaire businessman, the legend. But in this moment, he wasn't any of those things. He was just a son watching his mother be treated like she was nothing. His chest burned with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a deep, gnawing anger. It coiled inside him, tightening like a fist around his ribs. His first instinct was to march over, to stand in front of those people and demand an explanation. Did they know who she was? Did they even care? But he didn't move. Lucille had always taught him restraint. He heard her voice in his head, calm yet firm. The world will not always be kind to us, but our strength is in how we carry ourselves. He exhaled sharply, his mind racing. Would confronting them change anything? Would it erase the look in their eyes, the quiet rejection in their words? Would it undo all the years his mother had endured moments just like this, moments she never even told him about? Number Shaq turned and followed his mother at a distance, watching as she made her way to another bench, one farther from the shade, from the peacefulness of the oak tree. She sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant. He didn't need to see her face to know she was holding something in. She had always done that, Even when they had nothing, when bills stacked high and food ran low, she never let him see her struggle. She carried her pain quietly, always shielding him from it. And she was doing it now. Shaq felt something shift inside him. This was not just about today. This was about everything. About every silent insult, every door that had been closed on her, every moment she had chosen dignity over conflict. This wasn't just a bench, it was a message that said you don't belong here. And Shaq? He wasn't about to let that message go unanswered. A plan started to form in his mind, not one fueled by anger, but by something deeper, something stronger. He had spent his whole life using his size, his voice, his presence to make an impact. But today, he would use something else. He would use power. The kind of power that couldn't be taken away. The kind of power that would remind this town, and everyone in it, exactly who his mother was. Exactly who she had always been. And he would make sure no one ever forgot it again. As he walked toward his mother, a calmness settled over him. He had work to do. Shaquille O'Neal sat in his home office, staring at the wall but seeing nothing. His house, a sprawling estate with marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and walls lined with championship trophies, felt unusually small tonight. The room was silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning, but inside him, a storm was brewing. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany desk, his fingers locked together. His mind replayed the scene at the park over and over again. His mother, standing there, her hand just inches from that bench before they blocked her path. The way she had simply nodded and walked away, as if she had already known how that moment would end. The quiet dignity in her retreat. And the smirks, the entitlement in their eyes. The way they had dismissed her like she was invisible. Shaq exhaled sharply and pushed back in his chair. His fists curled at his sides. All his life he had worked to be more than just his size. People had always looked at him and expected brute strength, expected him to use his fists before his words. And yet, for all his wealth, his fame, his influence, he still felt powerless in that moment. He stood up and walked across the room, stopping in front of a massive glass display case. Inside, a collection of his greatest achievements stared back at him. Championship rings, MVP trophies, signed jerseys from legends he had played alongside. A lifetime of success captured in glimmering gold and crystal. But what did any of it mean when he had just stood there? What was the point of being Shaquille O'Neal if he couldn't stop something like that from happening? His mind drifted back to childhood, the long nights, the smell of his mother's perfume as she kissed him goodbye before heading to work, the tired look in her eyes when she came home after double shifts at the hospital, barely able to stand, but still managing to ask if he had eaten. He remembered the times she went without meals so he could have an extra serving. The shoes she wore until the soles were worn thin because every dollar had to go toward his future. The nights when the electricity flickered off, but she made a game of it, pretending they were on an adventure instead of sitting in a house they could barely afford. Everything he was, everything he had, was because of her. And today, a few people in a park had treated her like she was nothing. He gritted his teeth, pacing the room now. The anger in his chest wasn't just about today. It was about every time something like this had happened. The moments she never told him about. The ones she had carried alone. He stopped pacing. Took a deep breath. Anger was easy, but it wouldn't fix anything. He could already hear her voice in his head. Violence solves nothing. She had told him that since he was a kid, back when he used to come home furious at kids who mocked him for his size. Being strong isn't about what you can break. It's about what you can build. So what was he supposed to do now? He couldn't change what happened. He couldn't make those people see her the way he saw her. But maybe he could make sure no one else ever had to feel like she did. A plan started to take shape, slow at first, then clearer with every passing second. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving a point to those specific people. It was about something bigger. He turned back to his desk, grabbed his phone, and made a call. "Find out who owns that park," he said. A pause on the other end. Then the voice of his longtime business associate. "Which park?" Shaq's grip tightened on the phone. "The one where my mother wasn't allowed to sit." By morning, Shaq was already deep in research. The park was privately owned, a holdover from decades ago when certain parts of town were unofficially segregated. The owners had changed hands multiple times, but the attitude toward certain visitors had remained the same. Nothing illegal, nothing outright, just unspoken rules. Rules that had been loud and clear to his mother yesterday. Shaq sat back, absorbing the information. He had spent years using his wealth to build schools, scholarships, businesses. He had given millions to communities in need. But this was personal. He could buy the park. That was the easy part. But what? Did he with it afterward? That had to mean something. For the first time since yesterday, he smiled. The next few days were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and legal paperwork. Shaq moved quickly, using his connections to speed up the process. It wasn't just about the purchase, it was about control. He didn't want to own the park just to say he did. He wanted to change it. He ignored the murmurs from local officials, the raised eyebrows from people who didn't understand why a man like him would care about a small-town park. They weren't the ones who had watched their mother be humiliated. By the end of the week, the deal was done. Shaq O'Neal owned the park, and he wasn't keeping it the same. He announced a grand reopening event, invited the entire community, sent personal invitations to local leaders, reporters, families, and business owners. Even the ones who had refused Lucille a seat. Especially them. The night before the event, Shaq sat in his mother's kitchen, the same place where she had once counted pennies to pay rent, where she had made every meal stretch just a little further. She poured him a cup of coffee, watching him over the rim of her own mug. "You've been busy," she said. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his beard. "Yeah." She didn't ask what he had done. She didn't have to. She already knew. Lucille was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "I taught you well," she said, sipping her coffee. Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, you did." She reached across the table, resting a hand on his. A small gesture, but it said everything. The next morning, the park was unrecognizable. The worn-out benches had been replaced with brand-new seating. Flowers lined the pathways. The playground had been upgraded. A new community center stood at the far end, offering free resources for families in need. But the biggest change? A bronze plaque mounted near the entrance. It read, "Lucille O'Neal Park, a place where everyone belongs." When Shaq stepped onto the stage at the event, he saw the crowd gathered before him. Families, children, young and old. And standing near the back, the same people who had denied his mother a seat just days ago. He didn't call them out. He didn't need to. Instead, he told a story. A story about a woman who worked harder than anyone but was always treated as less. A woman who never raised her voice, never fought back, because she believed in dignity over conflict. A woman who, just days ago, had been denied a simple seat in a public park. And then, Shaq revealed the truth. "This park now belongs to her," he said. Gasps, whispers, and then applause. A silent storm had been brewing inside him for days. But this was the calm after. This was justice. As the event ended and people explored the park, Shaq stood back and watched as his mother took a seat on one of the new benches, looking around with quiet pride. This time, she wasn't walking away. She was home. Shaq sat in his dimly lit office, a laptop glowing in front of him. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating for a moment before typing the name of the park into the search bar. Parkwood Reserve. A place that seemed so harmless, so ordinary. A place where families gathered, where children played, where people like his mother should have been able to sit and rest without a second thought. But something about that moment at the park, the way those people had so effortlessly dismissed her, told him this was bigger than just one incident. He hit enter. At first, the search results were what he expected. News articles about community events, a few social media posts from locals enjoying a day out. But as he scrolled further, the tone of the articles changed. A few pieces stood out. Blogs, local history records, reports from years ago. There was a pattern. Shaq leaned in, his heartbeat steady, but strong. This wasn't just about his mother. It wasn't just about that bench. This had been happening for decades. The park had been around for nearly a century, built in a time when segregation wasn't just an unspoken rule. It was law. Over the years, the laws had changed, but the attitude hadn't. There were no signs that said whites only. No official rules banning people like Lucille from sitting wherever they wanted. But there were the whispers, the looks, the way people who didn't fit the unspoken standards of Parkwood Reserve were made to feel like they were trespassing. It was subtle, always quiet, always unspoken. And it had worked. Shaq clicked through pages of old records, statements from longtime residents, buried reports about complaints that had never gone anywhere. Families turned away. Elderly people were ignored when they asked for assistance. A pattern of quiet, persistent exclusion. And then, he found something that made his stomach tighten. A list of names. Not just complaints, but actual incidents. Times when people had spoken up about being made to feel unwelcome. Names of individuals who had either filed complaints or had been mentioned in old news clippings about disturbances at the park. One name stood out. Lucille O'Neal. Shaq's breath caught in his throat. He clicked on the article, his hands gripping the sides of the laptop. The piece was small, buried in a digital archive from over 30 years ago. It was a brief mention in an editorial column about a young mother, Lucille O'Neal, a nurse at the time, who had been quietly asked to find another place to sit by a group of park regulars. The same park, the same insult. But back then there was no Shaq, no millionaire son watching from a distance. She had been alone. She had walked away. And she had never told him. Shaq closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. His mother had been carrying this battle alone for decades. She had never wanted to burden him with it. Maybe she thought it wasn't worth mentioning. Maybe she had seen too much of the world to believe it would change. But that moment in the park, days ago, she had known exactly what was happening. And yet, she had walked away without a word. Because that was who she was. She had spent her whole life choosing dignity over confrontation. But Shaq? He wasn't staying silent. The next morning, Shaq was on the phone before the sun had even risen. He called everyone, lawyers, city officials, community leaders. He wanted answers. He wanted to know who had the real power over that park. The more he dug, the clearer the picture became. Parkwood Reserve was technically privately owned, but it had been donated to the city decades ago under certain conditions. Conditions that allowed the original private ownership group to still have a say in the park's maintenance, funding, and, most importantly, who was welcome. It was all legal. All buried under contracts, hidden behind bureaucracy. But the message had always been the same. This place isn't for you. Shaq clenched his jaw. For years, his mother and people like her had been pushed away. But they had forgotten one thing. This wasn't the same little boy whose mother had been denied a seat 30 years ago. This was Shaquille O'Neal, and he was about to do something no one saw coming. By noon, Shaq was standing in the office of a high-powered real estate attorney. The man across from him looked slightly overwhelmed, flipping through paperwork, scanning documents Shaq had shoved across the desk. "You're serious about this?" the attorney asked, adjusting his glasses. Shaq didn't blink. "I don't waste time playing games." The attorney exhaled. "Buying out the remaining stake in the park is possible, but I don't care what it costs," Shaq interrupted. The attorney sat back, studying him. "This won't change the past." Shaq's expression remained unreadable. "I'm not trying to change the past. I'm making sure no one else ever has to go through it again." Days passed. Shaq worked in silence, keeping the details out of the media. This wasn't about headlines. This wasn't about publicity. This was about his mother, about every single person who had ever been turned away, made to feel like they didn't belong. By the end of the week, the deal was done. Shaq O'Neal now owned full rights to Parkwood Reserve, and he had plans. The announcement came in the form of a community-wide event. No press conferences, no flashy social media posts, just a simple flyer sent to every home in the area. "Join us for a new chapter at Parkwood Reserve. Everyone welcome." The words felt heavier than they looked on paper, because for the first time in the park's history, they actually meant something. The night before the event, Shaq sat in his mother's living room, staring at an old photograph on the wall. A picture of her, holding him as a baby. young, tired, but smiling. She sat across from him, sipping her tea, her gaze soft but knowing. "You've been busy," she said. Shaq looked up. He could see it in her eyes. She already knew. Lucille set her cup down, her voice calm. "You didn't have to do this." "Yes," Shaq said, his voice steady. "I did." A pause. Then she smiled, a small, quiet smile. "You always were my best student," she said. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "This time," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I just made sure the lesson stuck." The next day, the park was unrecognizable. New benches, a renovated playground, a fresh walking trail. But the real change? A plaque near the entrance. Lucille O'Neal Park, a place where everyone belongs. People arrived, curious at first, then in awe as they realized what had happened. And standing among the crowd, at a distance, were the same people who had denied Lucille a seat days ago. They said nothing. They didn't have to. The message was clear. Shaq didn't confront them, didn't call them out. Their guilt was their own to carry. Instead, he walked over to his mother and gestured to the nearest bench, the one she had been turned away from. "Go ahead," he said softly. Lucille hesitated for just a moment, then sat down. For the first time in over 30 years, she didn't have to walk away. This time, she belonged. Shaq sat in his home office, the weight of his decision settling over him like a thick fog. His fingers tapped against the polished wood of his desk, his mind running through every possible outcome. He had spent years building his empire, on the court, in business, in philanthropy. But this was different. This wasn't about investments or profits. This was personal. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts. When he found the name he was looking for, he didn't hesitate. He pressed the call button, lifting the phone to his ear. "Shaq," a familiar voice answered on the second ring. It was David Calloway, a high-profile real estate investor who had worked with him on previous projects. "Didn't expect to hear from you today. What's up?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but firm. "I need you to find out who owns Parkwood Reserve." There was a brief pause. "The park? What for?" Shaq didn't blink. "I want to buy it." Another pause, then a low chuckle. "You serious?" "Dead serious." David's tone shifted, now laced with curiosity. "You know that's going to take some maneuvering, right? That place has been under private control for decades. Old money, tight circles. They don't just sell to anyone." Shaq's grip tightened on the phone. "They'll sell to me." David exhaled. "All right. Give me a few days. I'll see what I can dig up." Shaq ended the call and set his phone down. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. But when had anything worth fighting forever been? For the next few days, Shaq waited. He kept himself busy. Meetings, workouts, media obligations. But his mind always drifted back to the park. Every time he thought about it, he saw his mother's face as she walked away. The quiet acceptance, the deep, unshakable dignity. And then, the call came. David's voice was sharp, businesslike. "I have numbers. The park is owned by a private family trust, passed down for generations. The current owner? William Garrison III. Old money. The kind that doesn't like change." Shaq smirked. They were about to get a whole lot of it. "What's it gonna take?" he asked. David sighed. "It won't be cheap, and they're not looking to sell. This isn't just about money for them. It's about control." Shaq's jaw tightened. He knew that type. People who hoarded power just because they could, who held on to something not because they needed it, but because they didn't want someone else to have it. "I want a meeting," Shaq said. David hesitated. "You sure? This guy doesn't lose. He's not going to be intimidated by a big name." Shaq chuckled. "Good. Neither am I." 3 days later, Shaq walked into an exclusive downtown club, dressed in a tailored suit that made his massive frame look even more imposing. He spotted William Garrison III immediately, an older man, thin and sharp-eyed, sitting in a private corner of the club with a glass of whiskey in hand. Garrison barely looked up as Shaq approached. "You must be O'Neal," he said, swirling his drink. His voice was smooth, Practiced. The kind of tone that belonged to someone used to being in control. Shaq sat down across from him, his presence alone enough to shift the energy in the room. "I hear you own Parkwood Reserve," Shaq said. Garrison smiled. "That's right." He took a slow sip of his drink. "And before you ask, no, it's not for sale." Shaq leaned forward, resting his massive hands on the table. "Everything is for sale. It's just about the right price." Garrison chuckled, shaking his head. "See? That's where you're wrong. The park isn't just land to me. It's legacy, history. It's been in my family for generations." Shaq studied him. He could see it. The pride, the entitlement, the quiet belief that some things were meant to stay the same forever. Garrison continued, his voice smug. "People like you don't get it. Money buys a lot of things, but it doesn't buy tradition." Shaq's expression didn't change. "You mean it doesn't buy control?" Garrison's smirk faltered for just a second. Shaq leaned back, letting the silence settle between them. Then he reached into his pocket and slid a document across the table. "Here's my offer." Garrison glanced down at the number. His eyebrows twitched, but he didn't reach for the paper. "Generous," he admitted. "But I told you, it's not about money." Shaq smirked. "Then you'll love the second page." Garrison frowned but flipped to the next page. His face paled. Shaq had done his homework. The park's financial records, the dwindling tax breaks, the upcoming land reassessment that would cost Garrison's family millions. If he refused to sell now, he'd be bleeding money for years. Shaq folded his arms. "So, you can hold on to your legacy and let it bankrupt you, or you can sign the papers and walk away with a fortune." Garrison's jaw clenched. For the first time, he wasn't in control. 30 seconds of silence passed. Then, finally, he picked up a pen and signed. Shaq took the papers, stood up, and gave Garrison one last look. "This park isn't yours anymore." And then, he walked away. Within weeks, the deal was finalized. Shaquille O'Neal now owns Parkwood Reserve. The same park that had turned his mother away now belonged to her son. But Shaq didn't make an announcement. No press releases, no interviews, just a quiet purchase. Because this wasn't about attention. It was about change. And he had one final move to make. The invitations went out a month later. A grand reopening event. A new name. A new purpose. And an entire town invited, including the very people who had refused his mother a seat. The flyers were simple. "Join us for the new beginning of Parkwood Reserve. Everyone welcome." Shaq knew people would come, some out of curiosity, some out of excitement, and some, like the ones who had denied Lucille a bench, would come out of something else entirely. Fear, guilt, wondering if they would be called out. They had no idea what was about to happen. And Shaq, he couldn't wait. The night before the event, Shaq visited his mother. Lucille sat at her kitchen table, stirring a cup of tea, watching him with quiet amusement. "You're up to something," she said. Shaq smirked. "Always." She shook her head. "You didn't have to do all this, baby." "Yes, I did." He leaned forward, his voice softer now. "Because this isn't just about you. It's about everybody who was ever made to feel small." Lucille looked at him for a long time, then reached over and patted his hand. "You always did dream bigger than most," she said. Shaq smiled. "Well, you raised me that way." Lucille chuckled, shaking her head. "That I did." The morning of the event, the town gathered at the park. Everything had changed. The old, broken-down benches had been replaced with brand-new seating. The playground had been upgraded. A community center had been built on the far side of the park, offering free programs for families, students, and elderly residents. But the biggest change? A bronze plaque at the entrance. Lucille O'Neal Park, a place where everyone belongs. The crowd fell silent as they read the words. Among them were the same people who had turned Lucille away. They had no idea what to say. Shaq didn't call them out. He didn't need to. The message was right there in front of them. And when Lucille walked up to the nearest bench and finally sat down, Shaq knew. This time, she wasn't walking away. This time, she was home. Shaq stood in his mother's old bedroom, the scent of lavender and aged wood filling the air. The room was small, simple, nothing extravagant, nothing like the mansions he now called home. The walls held faded pictures of family, memories frozen in time. A younger version of himself grinned back at him from a photo on the nightstand, his mother standing beside him, proud as ever. But tonight, Shaq wasn't here for nostalgia. He had come looking for something, anything, that could help him understand what she had endured. The event was days away. The park was his now. The changes were happening. But a nagging thought kept creeping into his mind. How long had this been going on? How much had she never told him? He moved carefully, opening drawers, sifting through old keepsakes. Then, near the bottom of her wooden dresser, he found it. A small, dusty box, tucked away like a secret. He hesitated before pulling it out. Something about it felt personal. Lifting the lid, he found a few worn photographs, a handful of old letters, and then, his breath caught, a tattered diary. The cover was soft with age, the edges frayed, the ink on the pages slightly faded. He sat down on the edge of the bed, turning to the first page. And what he read made his chest tighten. April 3rd, 1984. They smiled when they told me they were going in a different direction. Said it wasn't about me, but about the fit of the workplace. I know what they meant. I didn't fit. I never do. Shaq's grip on the book tightened. His mother had never talked about losing jobs. He had known times were tough growing up, but she had always made it seem like things worked out in the end. But here it was, in her own words. She had been let go. Not because of her skills. Not because of performance. Just because of who she was. He turned the page. June 17th, 1987. Tried to take Shaquille to the library today. The lady at the front desk barely looked at me before saying they were at capacity. There were empty tables everywhere. I didn't argue. I just took his hand and left. I don't ever want him to feel like I felt today. Shaq swallowed hard. He had no memory of this. No recollection of ever being turned away from a library. Had she really shielded him from that much? He kept reading. August 29th, 1990. I sat on a bench today, just for a moment, just to rest. They made it clear I didn't belong. Didn't say it outright, but the message was clear. I got up and left. Shaquille was too young to notice. Thank God. Shaq's breath caught. A bench. His hands gripped the pages, his pulse pounding in his ears. He turned to the next entry, desperate to see if she had written more. September 2nd, 1990. It still stings. Not the words, but the way they looked at me. Like I was invading something that wasn't mine. I wonder if Shaquille will ever know this feeling. I pray he never does. Shaq shut the book, his hands trembling. He couldn't read anymore. His mother had been denied a seat in the very same park, not once, not twice, but over and over again. And she had never told him. Because she didn't want him to carry her pain. She had taken every slight, every insult, every quiet humiliation, and buried it. And now, all these years later, history had almost repeated itself. But this time, Shaq was here, and he wasn't letting it happen again. The next morning, Shaq arrived at the park early. Construction crews were already working, installing new benches, repaving pathways, adding the finishing touches to what would soon become Lucille O'Neal Park. He stood near the entrance, watching as a new plaque was carefully placed into the ground. The words gleamed under the morning sun. Lucille O'Neal Park, a place where everyone belongs. He exhaled slowly. She never fought for recognition, never raised her voice, never asked for justice. But that didn't mean she didn't deserve it. He pulled out his phone and made a call. A familiar voice answered. David, Shaq said, I need you to track down someone for me. Who? Shaq's jaw tightened. The people from the bench, the ones who turned my mother away. There was a pause. You sure about that? Shaq's voice was calm. Yeah, I'm sure. 2 days later, Shaq sat inside a quiet cafe, waiting. Then the door opened. 3 people walked in, 2 men and 1 woman. the same ones from that day in the park. They looked uneasy, shifting as they approached his table. Shaq didn't stand, didn't speak at first. He simply gestured to the seats across from him. They hesitated before sitting. The air was thick with tension. Finally, one of the men cleared his throat. We weren't sure why you wanted to meet." Shaq studied them for a long moment. Then he pulled the diary from his pocket and set it on the table. He opened it in 1990. Then he looked up. "Read it." The woman hesitated, then leaned forward, her eyes scanning the page. As she read, her face slowly changed. Shaq watched as realization dawned on them. This wasn't just about them. This was bigger than a single moment, bigger than a single mistake. It was a pattern, a legacy of exclusion, and they had been a part of it. The woman swallowed hard. "We didn't know." Shaq's gaze was steady. "You didn't care to know." Silence. The second man looked down, ashamed. "We were wrong." Shaq nodded. "Yeah, you were." Another beat of silence. Then the first man spoke again, his voice quieter now. "How do we fix it?" Shaq exhaled. This was the part his mother would have wanted. The part that wasn't about revenge, but about change. "You start by showing up," he said, "at the event. And then, you listen." They nodded. And for the first time, Shaq felt something shift. This wasn't about punishing the past. It was about building the future. The day of the event arrived. Hundreds of people gathered in the park, watching as Shaq took the stage. The new sign stood tall behind him, gleaming in the sunlight. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He told them about his mother, about the battles she fought in silence, about the park. And then, he told them about the diary. As he spoke, the crowd grew still. Some people lowered their heads. Others exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the truth. But truth wasn't meant to be comfortable. By the time he finished, the air felt different. Changed. Shaq stepped back from the microphone, turning toward his mother. Lucille smiled up at him, her eyes filled with something unspoken. Pride. Love. Gratitude. She stood, walked toward the nearest bench. And this time, she sat. Not because she had to, because she belonged. The morning of the event arrived crisp and clear, the sun casting long golden streaks across the freshly paved walkways of the park. A light breeze rustled the newly planted trees, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass through the air. It was the perfect day for a new beginning. Shaq stood behind the stage, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. He had worn jerseys in front of millions, stood under the blinding lights of championship games, and commanded the attention of stadiums packed with roaring fans. But today felt different. Today, it wasn't about him. Today was about her. Through the gaps in the curtains, he saw the crowd forming. The town had turned out in full force. Families, students, community leaders, reporters, and of course the ones who had denied his mother a seat. They stood off to the side, stiff and uncomfortable, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. They weren't sure if they had been invited or summoned. Shaq exhaled slowly. Let them squirm. He adjusted the microphone clipped to his lapel and stepped onto the stage. The murmur of the crowd quieted as Shaq walked to the podium. Even in a suit, even without a basketball in sight, he owned the space. He let the silence linger for a moment, then finally spoke. "I want to tell you a story." His deep voice carried across the park, smooth, deliberate. The crowd leaned in. A story about a woman who worked harder than anyone. A woman who spent her life raising a son, making sacrifices he never even knew about. A woman who never asked for recognition, never raised her voice, never demanded more than what was fair. Shaq's gaze scanned the crowd, locking onto familiar faces. The ones who had turned Lucille away. They looked down, suddenly finding their shoes fascinating. Shaq continued. A woman who, just days ago, was denied a simple seat in this park. The weight of the words settled over the audience like a heavy fog. Some people whispered, others shifted uncomfortably. A few heads turned, searching for Lucille in the crowd. She was there, standing near the front, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. Shaq's voice dropped lower, more controlled. You see, this story isn't new. It didn't start last week. It started long before that. He pulled a small book from his pocket, the worn-out diary he had found in his mother's old things. Decades ago, this same woman sat in this same park, and she was told the same thing. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the older attendees shifted uncomfortably, as if they suddenly realized this was more than just an isolated event. Shaq flipped open the diary, running his fingers over the fragile pages. My mother never told me about the battles she fought. She never wanted me to carry her pain. But make no mistake, she fought them. He let that sink in before closing the book and setting it down. Some people fight with their fists, some fight with their voices, and some, like my mother, fight by simply existing with dignity in a world that tells them they don't belong. The crowd was utterly silent now. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, their pens hovering uselessly above their notebooks. Shaq took a step forward, his presence towering. And that's why I made a decision. His voice hardened, not with anger, but with finality. This park no longer belongs to the people who made my mother feel like she was trespassing in her own community. Gasps. A ripple of shock spread through the audience. Shaq let it settle before delivering the final blow. This park now belongs to her. The crowd erupted. Gasps turned into murmurs. Murmurs turned into applause. Some people stood, clapping. Others looked around in stunned disbelief. The reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras clicking, microphones tilting forward. Shaq didn't move, didn't smile. He just let the moment breathe. He spotted them, the ones from the bench watching from the back. Their faces were pale, their bodies stiff. The realization had hit them like a train. They weren't just part of a moment. They were part of history now. Shaq stepped back from the microphone, motioning toward his mother. Lucille hesitated, then walked forward, the crowd parting for her like the sea. She climbed the steps slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she reached the podium. Shaq bent down and whispered, "Say something, Ma." She shook her head, eyes glistening. "You already did." He smiled and turned back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice full of pride, "welcome to Lucille O'Neal Park." The applause roared louder, and this time, Lucille didn't walk away. She stayed, because this time, she belonged. The applause was still echoing through the park as Shaq stepped down from the stage. His mother stood beside him, her hands warm in his as people clapped, some wiping away tears, others nodding solemnly at the weight of what had just happened. Shaq had expected a reaction. He had expected the town to be moved, for people to recognize the injustice that had been buried in their own backyard. But what he hadn't expected, what no one had expected, was the voice that suddenly cut through the noise. I need to say something." The crowd shifted, confused. The clapping faded as heads turned, eyes searching for the source. And then, Shaq saw him. One of them. One of the men who had refused Lucille a seat on that bench. The air felt suddenly heavier, as if the entire park had drawn in a collective breath and was waiting to see what would happen next. The man hesitated, swallowing hard. His hands twitched at his sides, his face pale. He looked like someone standing at the edge of a cliff, not sure if he should step forward or turn back. Shaq didn't say a word. He simply watched. The man licked his lips, his voice rough when he finally spoke. I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't even know if I should." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one interrupted. The man's eyes flickered toward Shaq, then Lucille before dropping to the ground. "When we told you that bench wasn't for you," his voice wavered. "That wasn't the first time I've done something like that." Lucille's expression remained unreadable. Shaq's arms folded across his chest, but still, he said nothing. The man let out a breath, as if bracing himself. "I grew up in a house where hate was normal," he admitted. "Not loud hate, not the kind you see on the news. The quiet kind. The kind that teaches you without saying the words out loud. The kind that lets you know who belongs and who doesn't." A few people in the crowd stiffened. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The man ran a hand over his face. "When I was a kid, My grandfather used to tell me stories about how things used to be, about how certain people knew their place and how the world worked better that way. His jaw clenched. I believed him, because that's what kids do, right? They believe what they're told. Lucille's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. The man exhaled. I carried those lessons with me, didn't even question them. They weren't orders. They were just the way things were. He shook his head, his shoulders tightening. And then, years later, I saw you. His eyes met Lucille's. You walked toward that bench, and something inside me told me it was my job to make sure you didn't sit there. That's what I had been taught. That it wasn't about rules or signs. It was just an understanding. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few people shifted, uncomfortable with the raw honesty unraveling in front of them. The man swallowed. But today, when I heard Shaq talk about the past, about his mother sitting in this same park all those years ago, about walking away again and again, I realized something. He let out a shaky breath. I wasn't protecting anything that needed protecting. I wasn't upholding some grand tradition. I was just following a lie. He turned toward Lucille fully now. His hands clenched at his sides, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. For the first time, the words didn't sound forced. They weren't an automatic response or a shallow apology given just to move past the moment. They were real. A heavy silence fell over the park. Some in the crowd still looked skeptical, their faces unreadable. Others watched with something like hope flickering in their eyes. Because the question that hung in the air now wasn't whether he had changed. It was whether people like him could. Shaq looked at him for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. Not because the man deserved instant forgiveness. Not because the past was erased. But because sometimes the first step to change is admitting you were wrong. And sometimes that was the hardest step of all. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden hues over Lucille O'Neal Park. A soft breeze carried the laughter of children across the open space, blending with the rhythmic creak of swings and the distant bark of a playful dog. The transformation had begun. Just weeks ago, this was a place where some people felt welcome and others didn't. Where quiet exclusion lived not in words, but in glances, in unwritten rules that had been followed for generations. Now, the park belonged to everyone. Shaq stood near the entrance, watching as life unfolded before him. Families of all backgrounds filled the picnic tables. Elderly couples walked the newly paved trails, their steps slow but steady. Teenagers played basketball on the freshly resurfaced courts, the sound of sneakers squeaking against the pavement. For the first time, no one was avoiding certain areas. No one was looking over their shoulder. People sat where they pleased, because they could. At a bench near the fountain, an older woman with salt and pepper curls sat quietly, reading a book. A few feet away, a young mother rocked a stroller back and forth, humming a tune to her baby. Their eyes met. A simple glance, nothing more. But instead of the usual awkward flicker of discomfort, of uncertainty about whether they should acknowledge each other at all, something different happened. The older woman smiled. The young mother smiled back. And just like that, a wall crumbled. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No speeches, no grand gestures. Just a small, quiet shift in the way two people saw each other. A few yards away, a group of young men stood near the basketball court, eyeing the game in progress. They weren't sure if they should join. Then one of the players, a tall, lanky teenager with a headband and a confident smirk, paused, spinning the ball in his hands. "You guys play?" he called out. The group hesitated. The answer was yes. They played. They had always played, but not here, not at this court. But the invitation was real. No hidden message, no test. The lanky teenager grinned. "Come on, man. We need some competition." The hesitation lasted only a second longer, and today, that work had finally begun. As the sun started to set, the crowd thinned, but the energy in the air remained. Shaq watched as a father knelt beside his son, tying his shoelaces. As two women from different worlds shared quiet conversation on a park bench. as teenagers from different sides of town played a game of basketball together, laughing, competing, belonging. This wasn't a perfect world. But today, in this small corner of it, something real had changed. Something better had begun. Lucille took a seat on the nearest bench, the very thing she had once been denied. Shaq sat beside her, and for the first time in his life, he realized something. Some battles aren't won with force. Some battles are won by simply making sure no one ever has to fight them again. The years passed, but Lucille O'Neal Park remained. Seasons changed, leaves turned from green to gold, and the world outside kept moving. But inside these gates, something stayed the same. The park never faded into memory, never became just another place in town. It thrived. Children still ran through the open fields, their laughter carried by the breeze. Families gathered for picnics under the shade of the oak trees. The basketball courts never stood empty, always alive with the sounds of sneakers squeaking against pavement and the rhythmic bounce of the ball. It had become more than just a park. It had become a symbol. A place where people met, where conversations happened, where no one was turned away. And today, on a warm afternoon, the sun casting a soft golden glow over the benches, Lucille O'Neal sat in the very place she had once been denied. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't hesitate. She just sat. Because this time, she belonged from across the park. Shaq watched her. He stood near the entrance, hands in his pockets, his towering frame almost blending into the background. He had always been larger than life, on the court, on TV, in business. But this wasn't his moment. This was hers. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the world move around her. And for the first time, Shaq realized something. She wasn't just watching. She was part of it. A boy ran past her, laughing as he chased after a kite. A young couple sat on a nearby bench, whispering and smiling. A group of teenagers walked by, one of them calling out, "Good afternoon, Miss Lucille." She lifted her hand in a soft wave, her eyes warm. She had spent so much of her life moving through the world like a guest, always careful, always mindful of where she stood, where she sat, where she was allowed to exist. But here, she wasn't a guest. She was home. Shaq exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling as he took it all in. He had done a lot in his life. NBA championships, business empires, charity work. But this might have been the most important thing he ever did. Because this wasn't about a trophy. This wasn't about fame. This was about changing something that had been broken for far too long. He had once felt helpless, standing in this very park, watching his mother walk away from a bench she should have been free to sit on. He had felt a rage so deep it had nearly consumed him. But now, standing here, watching her sit with ease, watching the park flourish, that rage was gone, replaced with something deeper, something stronger. Peace. Shaq took a slow step forward, moving toward the bench, but then he stopped. Lucille was talking now, her voice soft but full of life. Shaq followed her gaze. An elderly man had sat down beside her. Not just any man. The man from the bench. Years had aged him, his hair now fully silver, his hands slower in their movements. But he sat beside her, not as an adversary, as someone who had changed. He leaned on his cane, his voice low but clear. "Never thought I'd see the day." Lucille smiled, her face holding no bitterness, no resentment, only wisdom. "Well," she said simply, "it had to come sometime." The man nodded, staring ahead, watching the park come alive around them. "I used to think this place belonged to people like me," he admitted. "That the world worked better when we all stayed in our own places." Lucille didn't reply right away. She let the words settle, let the weight of them breathe in the open air. Then, she looked at him. "And now?" The man let out a slow, tired breath. "Now, I know better." Lucille smiled again, this time wider. "I guess that means we both lived long enough to see something good." The old man chuckled. "Guess so." Then one of the guys stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Y'all don't know what you just asked for." Laughter rippled through the air. The game continued. Just like that, Another wall fell. Not far from the court, near a large oak tree, a man in his 60s sat on a bench, his hands folded over a wooden cane. He had been coming to this park for years, always sitting in the same spot, always watching the world move around him. But today was different. Because today, he wasn't alone. A boy, no older than 9, sat beside him, swinging his legs. The two of them looked mismatched in every possible way. One old, one young, one black, one white. But they were deep in conversation. The old man nodded, his voice carrying just enough for Shaq to hear. Now see, back in my day, basketball was different. None of this three-point shooting nonsense. The boy raised an eyebrow. You mean, y'all couldn't shoot? The old man chuckled. Oh, we could shoot. We just weren't out here chucking the ball from half court every 5 seconds. The boy grinned. Sounds like y'all just didn't have range. A burst of laughter. Two people, who might have never spoken to each other before today, finding common ground. Another wall, gone. Even the ones who had once enforced the unspoken rules of the park had changed. Not because they had been forced to, but because they had seen the truth. The man who had denied Lucille a seat weeks ago now walked the paths quietly, his shoulders squared, his face thoughtful. He had no speech to give, no grand apology to repeat. But today, he wasn't just passing through. Today, he was here with his granddaughter. She ran ahead of him, her blonde curls bouncing as she raced toward the playground. Papa, hurry up, she called, waving for him to follow. He watched her for a moment, then let out a breath and followed, taking a seat near a woman, a black woman, who was also watching her child play. The two sat in silence for a long moment. Then finally he cleared his throat. Which one is yours? The woman, surprised at the conversation, gestured toward a boy on the swings. That one, red shirt. The man nodded. He's got some energy. She smiled. You have no idea. He chuckled. Yeah, I think I do. Another wall, crumbling. As the afternoon stretched on, Shaq felt a presence beside him. Lucille. She stood tall, her face glowing in the sunlight, her hands folded in front of her. Shaq looked down at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Not bad, huh? Lucille exhaled, looking out at the park. The people, the conversations, the change. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, she turned to him, her eyes warm. You did good, baby. Shaq chuckled. You act like you didn't have anything to do with it. She smirked. Oh, I did. I just let you think it was your idea. He laughed, shaking his head. For the first time in weeks, maybe even years, he felt at peace. This wasn't just about the park. It was about undoing something that had been broken for generations. They sat in silence after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because sometimes silence means understanding. Shaq, still watching from a distance, felt his throat tighten. He had spent so many years believing some people couldn't change, that some people would never want to. But here was proof that maybe, just maybe, they could. Shaq finally stepped forward, his long strides carrying him toward the bench. Lucille looked up as he approached, her eyes full of warmth. Well, look who decided to stop lurking, she teased. Shaq chuckled, taking a seat on the other side of her. I was giving you your moment. Lucille patted his hand. Every moment I have is because of you. Shaq shook his head. No, Ma, it's because of you. She studied him for a second, then smiled softly. I guess we did this together, huh? Shaq looked around the park, at the families, the laughter, the life, and nodded. Yeah, he said. We did. As the sun dipped lower, casting long golden shadows across the grass, Lucille sighed, content. I used to wonder what it would feel like, she said. Shaq glanced at her. What? She looked out at the park, at the children playing, at the people sitting freely on benches without second-guessing whether they belonged there. To not have to walk away. She turned to him, her eyes full of something powerful. I don't have to wonder anymore. Shaq swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. No, you don't. Lucille smiled, leaning back, letting the sun warm her skin. For the first time in her entire life, she didn't have to shrink herself, didn't have to be careful, didn't have to walk away. Because now this place, this world, belonged to her too. And she was finally home. Some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to spark change. This isn't just about a bench, it's about who gets to sit, who gets to stay, and who refuses to walk away. Because real power isn't in what you own, it's in what you choose to stand for. So ask yourself, when the moment comes, will you be the one to turn away, or the one who makes a difference?